Hi there, I'm Scott Hall with Moroso Performance, and thanks for joining us for this edition of Moroso Television. What we're going to show you today is how to install your Moroso crank trigger kit and how easy it is and how fundamental of an increase in performance you're going to get from having this kit on here. Moroso's had crank trigger kits for well over 30 years, and we're going to show you from start to finish how simple it is and a lot of little tips and secrets on how to make this thing perform well and why it does what it does. So hang tight with us. We're going to get this thing out of the box and we're going to show you from start to finish how quickly, simple, and easy it is to install this. And when we're done, you should be able to just push your ignition button and start this thing right up, and off you go with many years of reliable service with your Moroso crank trigger. Okay, let's get started by installing our crank trigger wheel onto the front of the big block Chevy balancer that we have here. Now what we've done is we've set up this motor and turned the balancer so we're at about 30 degrees before top dead center, which is going to be an ideal place to try to initially start this engine once we've installed the crank trigger sensor and the entire unit. What we've got here is there's a register on most balancers. Very critical because on the back side of the wheel there's a register that lines up on the front of the balancer and keeps the concentricity of it. So we're going to just put this wheel up here in any random spot, put our 3 bolts in, and later once we put the sensor on, we'll show you how important it is to then line up the wheel to the sensor and get the phasing of it just right. Tighten up these bolts, press on our wheel, now we're locked in and we're good. Next we're going to go and actually install the sensor into the arm and bolt the whole thing up and make it run. Here are all the components to assemble the Moroso transducer onto the mount into the arm that'll go onto the big block Chevy engine. What we have is the Moroso transducer, the transducer mount, and the transducer arm and the backing piece. What makes one of the features about the Moroso transducer mount nice is that our arm has a much shorter throw than the competitors, therefore allowing clearance for 2-piece oil pans and in some cases the height of the diaper. What we've also done with our mounting block is we've recessed it into the back. So as you can see, it sits flush and doesn't stick up above it, which again allows diapers to come up in underneath this when it's mounted to the front of the motor. So now we're going to take our transducer mount, and we are going to thread this on. Even though we have a much shorter throw on this, you will see that we're able to phase both the wheel and the transducer in a lot more accurate way to actually give us the optimum position of having the transducer hopefully in the middle of this arm. Even though we don't have as much adjustment, we've provided the ability to get this thing properly phased between 26 and 36 degrees for optimum position. Screw in the transducer into the arm. And now we're ready to go and go mount this up on our big block engine. Now that we've assembled our transducer mount, let's get it bolted up to the front of the engine. On this big block Chevy, we're not running a motor plate. Moroso provides you with these 1/4-inch spacers to go behind the transducer arm. Typically with a motor plate, you would only run 2 of these, one at the top, one at the bottom. But in this case, we're going to run all 4 on it. So we're going to bring our bolts over here, mount it up on the block. And they're a Torx head fastener, so they do recess inside for a clean look. Put these on, it's a good idea to lock tight and torque them, as over time this thing ever loosens up on you, it'll definitely give you grief on your timing. Now with the positioning of this transducer is lined right up in the middle using this outer hole, so we're going to stick with that hole for now. Next up, we're going to come and show you from a front view how we're going to clock this and get this set up with a transducer wheel so we can properly get it phased and get the engine started. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to bring this transducer back off the adjuster nut, and we're going to run this in so we're pretty close to the wheel to just get ourselves started with the phasing of it. Now you can see we're going to bring this sensor up to the middle and just snug it up. Now you can see we have a magnet up here. So obviously we're not lined up at our 30 degrees of timing like we set up for earlier. So we're going to take this wheel and take out the fasteners. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pop this off. And we're going to try to find the closest phasing using these bolts in the balancer location. This one here isn't too bad, but we're going to see if we got a better position one somewhere that we can use. Nothing there. That one looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're going to run our bolts in. Tighten up the front of this crank trigger wheel, and as you can see, just sitting here at 30 degrees, that sensor is lined right up with that magnet, and that should be able to give us a great place to start this engine up. Now, some of the tech tips we can give you. People ask us all the time, what should my transducer clearance be? What you're going to do is you're going to go put a feeler gauge in between the transducer and the wheel. Moroso recommends typically 70 to 50 thousandths clearance there. And what happens is when this engine is spinning over as you're trying to start it, it creates an energy field in here that almost sends a signal back, almost like a generator would. And what happens is at low speed, ignition boxes need a very low voltage signal to tell it to fire and start the engine up. The closer this is to the wheel at lower speeds, the sooner that signal will be created. But once the engine is running, if this crank front is moving at all, it can try to touch the wheel down to the transducer. So that 70 to 50 thousandths typically tends to be a good mark to start from. If your engine turns over very slow, it may be required that you tighten up this gap a little bit. So we'll bring this in, snug up this nut, and at about 70 to 50 thousandths, we should be good to start. 30 degrees timing, pretty much ready to go right where we are.